Hello and welcome to the INSS simulation, War in the Middle East. I'm Itai Brun, Deputy Director of INSS, and we have here an excellent team of players, and I will introduce them shortly. Major General Reserve Nitsan Alon, a former commander of the IDF Central Command and a former head of the IDF Operations Directorate. Nitsan will play both the Israeli senior military level and the political level. General retired John Alon is the president of the Brookings Institution. John is a retired U.S. Marine four-star general, a former commander of the U.S. and NATO forces in Afghanistan, and a special presidential envoy for the coalition to counter the Islamic State. John will represent the United States. Dr. Ebtesam Ketbi is a professor of political science and the founder and president of the Emirates Policy Center. Ebtesam is playing both the UAE and the other Gulf states. Fyodor Lukyanov is the editor-in-chief of Russia in Global Affairs, chairman of the Council on Foreign and Defense Policy, and research director of the Valdai Discussion Club. Fyodor will play for Russia. Sima Shine is the head of the Iran program here at the INSS. Sima was the head of the research division at the Mossad and also former deputy director of Israel's Ministry of Strategic Affairs and the Deputy Director of the Israeli National Security Council. Sima will play for Iran. Shimrit Meir is a journalist and an expert on Arab and Middle East affairs, and she will play for Hezbollah. Professor Eyal Zisser is the Vice-Rector of the Tel Aviv University and a former director of the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies. Eyal will play for Syria. Thank you all for participating in the simulation. To set the basis for the game, we will now view the breaking news from the Israeli TV in Tel Aviv.
שלום רב לכם, אנחנו במשדר מיוחד בעקבות רצף האירועים במזרח התיכון ביממה האחרונה שגבה את חייהם של 16 ישראלים ולפציעתם של רבים נוספים. כוננות מיוחדת הוכרזה בישראל ובמדינות המפרץ. גם בארצות הברית התייעצויות קדחתניות. תחילה סיכום האירועים למי שלא עקב אחר ההתרחשויות במלואן. בשעה 4:30 לפנות בוקר שוגרו 6 טילים ממערב עיראק לכיוון ישראל. טיל בודד חדר את מערכת ההגנה ופגע בבניין רב קומות בתל אביב. 6 ישראלים נהרגו, 30 נפצעו, מיד נהיה בזירת האירוע. באותה עת, מיליציה עיראקית שנתמכת בידי איראן שיגרה רקטות על מתחם השגרירות האמריקנית בבגדד. איש מרינס אחד נהרג. האירועים האלה הם המשך ישיר למה שהתרחש אתמול סביב השעה 10:30, סדרת פיגועי ירי בטיילת המרינה בדובאי, ובמקביל בקניון בחריין סנטר סיטי בבחריין. הערכה היא שהפיגועים כוונו נגד תיירים ישראלים בפרט. בירי נהרגו 10 ישראלים, 8 אמריקנים ו8 אזרחים מקומיים. מוקדם יותר אתמול, בשעה 9:45, הכוחות החות'ים בתימן שנתמכים בידי איראן, שיגרו טילים מדויקים על מטרות בסעודיה ופגעו בין היתר במתקני זיקוק בג'דה. בשעות האחרונות החלה רכבת אווירית, בניסיון לפנות במהירות האפשרית את כל הישראלים מהמפרץ. אף ארגון או מדינה עדיין לא לקחו אחריות על התקיפות. פרשננו אהוד יערי מזכיר שבתחילת השבוע נהרגו 38 פעילים מאותה מיליציה במהלך מסדר בעיראק, ושמבחינת האיראנים החשבון עם ארצות הברית ועם ישראל על חיסולם של סולימני ושל פחריזאדה עדיין פתוח.
So, now for the first round, I will ask each of the participants to detail their actions considering their objectives, priorities, and strategy. I will start with you, Major General Reserve Nitsan Alon, playing for Israel. In addition to the objectives, priorities, and strategy, more specifically, how should Israel respond? 16 Israelis were killed. The nation is in a shock and depressed. If you decide to retaliate, in what force, against whom, and where will you do so?
Well, it's definitely a serious event that might create some major escalation, but I think that the Iranian played to our hand and create some important opportunities for Israel. Israeli interest is to keep the principles that Israel defends itself by itself, but it also an opportunity to elaborate the mutual range of mutual interest in between Israel and the GCC. And it's also help Israel to shape the new administration in Washington and create some linkage between the nuclear issue and the missile and terrorism issues. So Israel want to keep focus on the regional cooperation. We will retaliate against a massive retaliation by airstrike against Iranian facility and Iranian personnel, both in Syria and Western Iraq. We will do it at least in Iraq with close coordination with the US. And we prepare a second wave of retaliation in Iran itself, probably against some IRGC, Air Force targets, and maybe some more. That's for the beginning.
Thank you very much, Nitsan. The United States is played by General retired John Alon. At this current point in time, with the Biden administration taking office, how should the United States respond to the attacks and the killing of American citizens and soldiers? Are you coordinated with Israel? We just heard Nitsan. Does the Israeli response change anything for you?
This is a massive miscalculation by the Iranians. We're less than a week after the inauguration. The Biden administration made it very clear it was interested in attempting to reinvigorate the JCPOA in whatever form that would take. And this attack on American civilians in Dubai, in the Emirates, and on the US Embassy in Iraq is a massive miscalculation by the Iranians. And if they think that the Biden administration is going to be bogged down with COVID and the economy and racial equality and the issues associated with the trial of Donald Trump in the Senate, they're badly mistaken. The United States has got plenty of bandwidth to deal with this issue. As well, there'll be a couple other realities that we'll have to deal with as well, also. There'll be a different relationship between the Biden administration and the Netanyahu relationship, but there will not be a difference in the US support for Israel. There will also be a different relationship between the Biden administration and the Saudi administration, but we will still honor our responsibilities to provide for the stability of that regime, that nation as well. But also you'll see the Biden administration will be very supportive of the Abraham Accords. So with that, our priorities and our objectives in this case is to use this crisis as an opportunity to unveil the new Middle East policy and strategy under this administration. A very important dimension of that will be to try to prevent as much as possible a region-wide escalation of the conflict with Iran. But very early along in this administration, and now our hand has been forced on this matter, to make it very clear that the Biden administration will both contain and deter Iran. And we will reaffirm our position that Iran will never be permitted to have a nuclear weapon. And if we've got to put the issues about going back into the JCPOA on hold for now, then so be it. But Iran will not be permitted to have a nuclear weapon, nor will it be permitted to have a complete nuclear fuel cycle that highly enriches uranium, etc. We will convey as a priority our unambiguous continued support for Israeli security, and we want to leverage the Abraham Accords for a broader regional cooperation for the sharing of intelligence and necessarily for security matters. As to the strategy, our messaging will condemn the attacks and remind the world that the US had an interest in reconstituting the JCPOA. We'll openly confer with our JCPOA allies, Russia and China, on the nature of this attack and our potential responses to it. We'll warn Iran that any continued attack by Iranian-supported militias on American forces throughout the region will be immediately responded to with a massive American attack. We'll warn Iraq that they have a responsibility to care for our citizens, or we will act inside Iraqi sovereign territory. We'll provide immediate counterterrorism assistance as necessary to the Emirates and to Bahrain if they need it and they want it. We'll be happy to support that. US forces will go to the highest level of force protection posture, also air defense posture. We will position the USS Nimitz in the Gulf of Oman with the USS Macon Island. And it's as necessary when we conduct our airstrikes on those militia elements, and if any other Iranian elements attack us, those elements as well, we want the strikes to come off the carrier.
And now to Sima Shine, you are playing Iran. John Alon just said it was a miscalculation. Iran decided to conduct a limited terror attack, but with all the unfolding events, a large-scale escalation is a possible development. It is probably happening. You heard Nitsan, you heard John. How do you prepare yourself for an Israeli and maybe an American retaliation? How will you respond?
Well, Iran had a huge dilemma before he decided to do what he did. The dilemma was between the need to retaliate after what happened and to prevent the next event. On the other hand, there is a ongoing and continues to be a need to prevent a large-scale escalation. So within these limits, Iran has decided to do all these strikes in order to tell everyone that there is a limit to what Iran is going to accept against its people, against its proxies. At the same time, Iran will try to find the ways and to transfer to the Americans and to the others that there is no second strike if the retaliation against that will be in a limited way. The utmost interest is not to get into any strikes on Iranian soil, and of course, to prevent an escalation of a full-scale war, either from Israel or especially from the US. So I said, one is diplomatic channels to make sure that there is no escalation. Two, of course, is an alert of all the forces. Three, diplomatic dialogue with the Russians, asking them to use the red line to Washington in order to prevent the escalation. And the utmost interest is to preserve the stability, because the regime understands what are the consequences once Israel and the US decide to retaliate together.
And if Israel is conducting a massive attack against your forces in Syria, or maybe even in Western Iraq, are you going to do something active?
If this is only in Syria and Iraq, it doesn't touch Iranian soil, probably, and it is not massive numbers of people killed. Probably Iran will try to say, okay, we did something, now there is a retaliation. If there is no more, we'll stop in this place. But everybody will know that we were willing to do things that nobody before estimated we will do.
Thank you, Sima. And now to Dr. Ebtesam El-Ketbi. You are playing for the UAE and on Saudi terror attacks in both Dubai and Bahrain. Israel is now retaliating, probably also the United States in Iraq. We are in the eve of a possible large-scale escalation. What is the policy and what are the actions of the Gulf states?
The top UAE priority is to prevent another attack on UAE soil or the other Gulf states. Second, the UAE will try to identify the source of missiles attacks. To achieve both objectives, it would call on the UN Security Council to condemn the attack and investigate the responsibility of attackers. The UAE properly will reach out to the US and Europeans, China and Russia to take part in the investigation of the incident. Once it identifies the culprits, it will coordinate its response with Saudi Arabia and Bahrain to carry retaliation against the Houthi. The UAE and allies would take advantage to further isolate the Houthi and its backers in Iran. The US has already declared the Houthi as a terrorist organization. Coordinating with Washington and other capitals, the UAE would seek a UN Security Council resolution condemning the Houthis and branding them as a terrorist organization. It would seek further to put Iran on notice for aiding and abetting the Houthis. The UAE would run an information campaign against Iran and Houthi malign activities in the region, expose these activities at the regional and international levels, pursue the labeling of Houthis as a terrorist organization, persuade the international criminal courts to indict Houthis leadership as war criminals for attacking deliberately innocent civilians. Last but not least, use Israeli channels to persuade Washington to impose a naval blockade against the Houthi to prevent Iran from resupplying missiles to Houthi. Moreover, the UAE will call on the Arab and African Red Sea states to enforce the embargo.
Thank you very much, Ebtesam. And now turning to Fyodor Lukyanov, who is playing for Russia. Are there opportunities in this scenario for Russia? And what are the actions that you are going to take to capitalize on them?
Russian Federation and Russian leadership will be highly interested in minimizing destabilizing effect on the whole region. A Russian interest in the Middle East, which, as Russian analysts believe, is frequently misunderstood in the region and in the West, is not to be a dominating force in the region. But Russian ability to work there is based on keeping a rather constructive, at least workable relationship with basically everybody. And this is maybe a personal achievement of President Putin, that he has quite intense talks with basically all actors there. And this is, on the one hand, this crisis might give new opportunities to use this leverage and this capacity, because we know that Putin, probably this is his favorite business, to get involved in very complicated geopolitical constellations and try to settle this, not to finally reconcile parts, but at least to stabilize situation. The minor model of that we saw recently in Southern Caucasus. But at the same time, this is a big danger that in such a tense atmosphere and in such a dangerous situation, this will not work. And that would lead to extremely negative impact on many Russian interests. And main Russian interest there is, of course, to keep going with some kind of political stabilization of Syria. And of course, if a big war starts between Iran, Israel, and involving others, that would mean huge destabilization in Syria automatically. So I think that Russian position will be to get engaged in very intense, very high-level diplomacy with all leaders in the region. Again, Putin has a good relationship with practically all. It might be used as a rare, nowadays, a rare reason to reach to the Biden administration to try to discuss issues, because on the one hand, Russia and the United States together are interested in more or less stable situation. At the same time, of course, Russian fear would be that Biden administration would use this crisis to step up presence, including military presence in the Middle East, and try to reverse those trends which emerged under Trump administration.
Thank you very much. And now back to the region. Hezbollah is played by Shimrit Meir. Hezbollah is currently not involved in the events, not directly involved in the events. Shimrit, you might be called upon by Iran to act. To what extent are you subject to Iranian interests, and how much of your actions will you seek to coordinate with Iran?
Yes, of course. And I think that's why the conventional wisdom would be that we will do our best to stay out of it. Because as you mentioned, the internal situation in Lebanon is on the verge of total collapse. And also our sense of legitimacy within Lebanon and in the Arab world is not what it used to be in 2006, and gets more and more eroded with every year. However, we have very little to lose, because of the fact that we've already given up to an extent on a Lebanese consensus. That's A. And B, we are sort of a buffer, and we understand our role in the moment of truth to be a sort of a buffer between the enemy and Iran itself. So I estimate that we will have to be part of it. It is simply too big for us to stay out of it. And once we will be heated, or we will be attacked, or we will be dragged in any way, shape, or form, we will use this to make a point. And the point should be on the battlefield, but also the point should be in a battle of ideas within the Arab world. And given the fact that the attack was on Israeli terrorists in the Gulf, this is being held in the context, the general context of normalization. And we have to represent the voice, the historic voice in the Arab world that rejects, or the Islamic world that reject this notion. Therefore, we will go for as many symbolic victories as we can achieve, i.e. Israelis tend to want a short battle or a short period of several days and then ceasefire, but we will not rest until we will have a decisive symbolic achievement, such as a landmark in Tel Aviv, or putting our flag in an Israeli village in northern Israel, or something along that line, or in our worst case scenario, in a case when we are being defeated decisively and lose all sense of backing from our own political allies and also the vast majorities of Lebanese.
Thank you very much, Shimrit. Professor Eyal Zisser is playing for Syria. Israel is now attacking massively in Syria. What can Syria do? To what extent are you subject to Iranian and Russian interests? Does Syria have something to gain from this scenario? And if so, how?
Well, frankly, we have nothing to do with what has happened. We made it very clear to the Iranians and to the Russians that we want, that we are not interested to engage or to be part of a confrontation between the Iranians and the Israelis, and they shouldn't use Syrian territory in order to attack Israel. I do believe that this was the case because the attack came from, or the missiles were launched from Iraq and not from Syria. Now, it's very easy for the Israelis to attack Iranian targets in Syria. We condemn it, but in this closed room, we don't care. I mean, and we don't have real options. We are focusing on the efforts to stabilize the situation in Syria, rebuilding our country. We have no interest in engaging in any sort of confrontation with Israel, so we will not let anyone to drag us into the to any major or severe conflict. Israelis can attack what they want in Syria. We will never retaliate. We will not retaliate, and they can do whatever they want. On the other hand, I would like to emphasize or to mention that during the last weeks, months, there was some improvement in Syria relations with the Gulf states. With the Emirates, we have good relations. We always have, during the war even. With Oman, some sign for improvement with the Saudis, with the Qataris. So we can play a role, because it's not only that we have no interest in an escalation in the immediate region, we don't have any interest in escalation in the Gulf. It's not the case that the Gulf states were against us. Now we'll try to bring the Iranians and the Gulf states together, and we can play a role.
Thank you very much, Eyal. So we are probably at the beginning of a round of confrontation, an exchange of blows in the Middle East, and now we would like to find out the intensity of the conflict. Can this escalation be contained, or will these series of blows that can be characterized as battle days developed into a large-scale confrontation in the Middle East? So for this purpose, let's take the game a week from now, and I'll tell you what happened during this week. During this week, as Nitsan said, Israel conducted a massive attack on Iranian targets in Syria in western Iraq, killing both Iranian but also Hezbollah personnel. In response, Hezbollah launched rockets at several cities in northern Israel, but trying not to go into a full-scale escalation. It did not attack cities south of Haifa, but these attacks killed several citizens in Israel. In turn, Israel attacked several targets in Lebanon itself, including targets of Hezbollah's precision-guided missile project in Beirut. There is also an escalation in Iraq based on these American strikes on the militia forces. Shimrit, Israel attacked Beirut. Will you attack Tel Aviv?
Yes, I think most definitely yes. I think we will have to save face in front of the Lebanese, but also in the great context of the Mukawama camp, we won't be able to tolerate, unless this is a very targeted attack that doesn't cause too many civilian casualties, or we are able to hide the consequences very efficiently. But if it'll be some kind of
let's say there are about 30 Lebanese people that were killed in the attacks.
So I think that Hezbollah will have to respond in something that is more than northern Israel, and I think that's not even complicated. If Hamas is daring to fire rockets to central Israel, then Hezbollah is expected to do so. And I think it will, in the context of a general conflict and all bets are off, it'll try to make as much impact in its targeting. Yes.
Shimrit, you are going into a large-scale escalation.
I think so. I think if the Iranians, to begin with, wouldn't want a large-scale escalation, they wouldn't have started such a noisy, coordinated attack. I think that's what they are going for.
Thank you, Shimrit. Nitsan, suppose Tel Aviv was attacked, and according to Shimrit, it might be attacked, and citizens were killed. Where does Israel take it from here?
Again, we want to keep this crisis and focus on the opportunity to create and leverage this crisis into cooperation, regional cooperation between Israel and both UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and others. So we try not to drag ourselves into a war in Lebanon. We will strike in Lebanon in pure military targets, mainly against the long-range missiles in Lebanon, and try not to hit Lebanese civilian, both in Beirut and other places, and keep focus on the opportunity to leverage it to regional cooperation, both in the strategic level and the operational level, with the Arab state, the modern Arab state in the Gulf.
But let's say, 12 Israelis were killed from this attack on Tel Aviv. This is not a reason to go to a large-scale operation in Lebanon?
I'm talking about the large-scale operation in Lebanon, but not one that will happen in the urbanic places in Beirut and others. There are dozens, maybe hundreds of targets that we can attack and strike in Lebanon, Hezbollah targets, before we go to targets in Beirut and targets that will drive us to a large-scale operation.
Thank you, Nitsan. Eyal, Syria, your sovereignty was harmed. As I understand, you are not going to respond. Will you allow Iran and its proxies to operate on your soil? Can you do something to stop them?
Of course, if they will insist or they will ignore our requests, they have their own presence there, and we don't have full control over what is happening even on Syrian soil. But our message is very clear, and I believe is backed by Russia. We shouldn't drag Syria into this war. The importance of Syria for Iran and for Hezbollah is not in dragging it into a war, but keep it as it is, stable under the leadership of Bashar al-Assad, looking to the future. And as for those small incidents, let me remind you that in Syria, 600,000 people were killed during the last 10 years. 8 million became refugees. 3/4 of the country was totally destroyed. So, you know, 10 people here, 10 people there are being killed. It's not something that can change our mind. We have nothing to do with this conflict. We have nothing to gain from this conflict. Very clear.
Thank you. John, probably the United States doesn't want this regional war to happen. What can you do?
Well, we noted the back channel messages that came to us from Tehran about their desire to contain the conflict and even de-escalate it. So we noted that. And that comes on the heels of messages that had been sent some time ago that the United States desired once again to reinvigorate the JCPOA. So we noted the Iranian message that came to us back channel. And we're going to watch very closely Iranian behavior. We, as I said, struck the militia elements in Iraq. We accomplished our targeting objectives there, but we remain poised throughout the entire region. We have a large air platform throughout the entire region beyond the Nimitz. We're ready to go if we have to re-attack those militia targets. And if there are additional attacks by the Iranians, we can begin to attack, if necessary, Iranian targets as well. Although, again, we're ready for this to be contained. We're going to work very closely with our Gulf partners, though, those in the Abraham Accord, to provide for comprehensive missile defense across the region. We've been doing this now for years. Missiles are being used. We want to ensure that our partners in the region are secure, and we'll work for enhanced missile defense across the region. We also want to work very closely with our partners in the region in a counter-terror context, sharing intelligence so that we can ensure that we can both protect American citizens, but also prevent Iranian or Shia militia elements from operating in our partner countries that can threaten American citizens or the citizens of those countries themselves. But we're ready to go. We're ready to expand this if necessary. The messaging is very clear. The Iranians need to pull their heads in on this matter. It was a massive miscalculation on their part to force our hands in this matter. And we will also support Israel as is necessary and support our Gulf partners should they come under attack.
Thank you very much. Fyodor, do you decide to restrict the players in any way? Can you restrict the players?
Yes, I think that the representative of Syria just mentioned that Syria will be highly interested to achieve that the Syrian territory will not be used as the battlefield between, say, Israel and Iran. And this is exactly what Russian leadership would like to achieve as well. Through, on the one hand, intense communication with Israelis, trying to encourage them not to fight Iran and Syrian territory. On the other hand, I'm sure that Russia will have consultations and communication with Iran, urging them not to escalate and try to avoid to drag in Syria in this. It's of course a question how successful those efforts will be. I can imagine that those efforts might be more successful between Russia and Israel than between Russia and Iran, because Russian-Iranian relationship in Syria is quite tricky, and the interests of parts are very much different. But still, since Iran, on the other hand, as General Alon mentioned, is sending back channel messages to United States using Russian channel as well, certainly Iran will be eager to at least listen to what Russia is saying. So at the end of the day, again, a Russian highest priority will be to try to protect Syria from being a battlefield, and of course, to protect Russian military forces stationed there.
Thank you very much. And now, toward the end of this round, to Sima and to Ebtesam, and let's turn it into a regional issue. Sima, let's go from an Iranian perspective to the role of Iran as the leader of the Shia axis in the Middle East. How do you utilize the camp in this situation? Can you control the camp?
First of all, of course, I can control the camp, and I will do it. And we the Iranians do not want to waste Hezbollah on such an event, because our main I would say our main aim with Hezbollah is to be a threat on Israel against attacking our nuclear project. This is the ultimate goal, and this is the day when we will use Hezbollah to the utmost. Now, what happened now, we will try to make sure that Hezbollah is not dragged into a full-scale war with Israel. And in this case, even if there is a need to try and accept an Israeli attack without retaliation back, this is a very important element.
Sima, Shimrit wants to attack Tel Aviv. Will you restrain them?
Yes, no question about that. We don't want now Hezbollah to be deteriorating into a full-scale war with Israel. It's not the proper time, and we have always the fear that Israel will use such a situation together or separately from the US in order to attack our nuclear project. So from our point of view, it is very important, one, not to drag Hezbollah into a full-scale war. Two, we don't want to deteriorate our relations with the Gulf state to more than it was deteriorated already. Because at the end of the day, Dubai is the port for us, our economic relations with those countries. So we want to make sure that it stays on this level, does not deteriorate to a full-scale war.
Thank you, Sima. And Ebtesam, you are part of the Sunni moderate camp, maybe even leading it now. What can this camp do to avoid full-scale regional war between Israel, Hezbollah?
Well, first, Iran, we know that it's going to use its sleeping cells. So we will intensify intelligence cooperation between GCC and also with our we will exchange information with our international allies and also with the Israeli. And we will open a communication channel with Iran with the aim of sending clear message that destabilizing the UAE and GCC will necessarily mean damaging Tehran's trade interest in UAE. And also, we will enhance the UAE narrative on the strategic necessity of the Abraham Accord, and we will try to isolate Iran diplomatically.
Thank you all for your participation. As in other games that we conducted last year, we saw the great desire of all the key players to avoid large-scale escalation. The question is whether this desire can be fulfilled or it will take out of control with kind of a dynamic of escalation. Anyway, I think it's a very good basis for the commentators to analyze what happened here in the game. Thank you very, very much again.